Je voulais simplement ton âme, toi, tu voulais qu'on partage nos charmes.
Veus femenines de la poesia medieval, una sèrie de podcast del projecte Women and Medieval Song finançat pel Ministerio de Ciencia, Innovación y Universidades amb la col·laboració de l'Institut d'Estudis Catalans.
En aquest episodi volem conversar sobre la poesia femenina al món nòrdic medieval amb el professor Terry Gunnell i jo mateixa, la Inés García. Terry, welcome to our podcast on women poetry in the Nordic Middle Ages. Terry Gunnell is professor in folkloristics at the Háskóli Íslands, the University of Iceland. He has been teaching Old Nordic religion for many years, and he's also a specialist in poetry, and in my opinion, the most renowned researcher in the field of poetical performance. Today we're going to talk about women in the North, women who compose poetry. They were called skáldkonur. The most famous skáldkona is probably Jórunn Skaldmær. She was a woman who lived in the early 10th century and probably served at the court of Norwegian King Harald Hárfagri. Terry, are there more examples of historical female characters who composed poetry? And thinking about poetry composition in Middle Age Iceland, how was poetry composed outside the court? Because maybe this is a huge difference with continental European Middle Age poetry.
Thanks for inviting me to start off with. This is very interesting, exactly how few women are mentioned in lists of the skald, of the poets in Old Norse. Of course, we need to remember that most of the material is being written by men, and the oral stories that they're based on are often coming from men as well. So the emphasis in the material that we have, literary material that we have, is always going to be very male when it comes down to it. Mm-hmm. And if we look at the lists of poets on the Skaldic database, for example, which has all of the Skaldic poetry, there are about 30 names there, but most of them are just a few lines here and there. As you mentioned, we have this woman, Jórunn Skaldmær, who seems to come from Norway. She's the only woman of 67 named poets in Skaldskaparmál by Snorri Sturluson. Mm-hmm. We have another woman elsewhere who's called Þórhildur Skaldkona. Again, underlining the fact that both of these people are women, that they're different to the usual. Mm-hmm. We need to remember that, of course, many of the poets that we have are people who've traveled to Norway and are working with the Norwegian court, especially, sometimes the English courts and Danish courts. So they're travelers to start off with, which is something that very few women would have been involved in. They're looking after the home to start off with, and have very little to do in general terms with war and rulers. So they're much more connected with home. But it's pretty clear that they understood Skaldic poetry. As you mentioned yourself, there's a figure who is the sister of Gisli in Gisla Saga, who listens to him saying a verse which is sort of rather negative about somebody at a funeral, and she walks home, and when she gets home she's managed to decode this poem and understands it, and then gets rather annoyed, to say the least, of what he said. Yeah. This certainly shows that people need to decode poetry. It's not always immediate, but these women understand poetry. The same thing occurs in Kormáks Saga, where we have Kormákur, who is making love poetry to a particular girl called Steingerður. And she's not over happy about it, but she clearly understands the poetry that he's presenting. And in that area, that leads us into something slightly different, because it needs to be borne in mind that poetry has a strong element of magic to it. Love poetry was banned, for example, by law, because it was seen as having potential magical power. And if we look at a word like ljóð nowadays, which nowadays means poetry, just of any kind,
Mm-hmm.
Back in the past, that word is only used by Snorri in the meaning of magic.
Mm-hmm.
We have kveðskapur and things of this kind, which are different words, but ljóð underlines the connection with magic.
Mm-hmm.
And Odin, for example, when in Hávamál, when he goes over the magic that he can do, the last 3 ljóð that he says he can do are about winning women over. So again, this power of magic.
Mm-hmm.
That in itself is a very interesting bridge to how many of these poet women in the list of poetry that you find in the database here, how many of these women are actually seen as being magicians or women
Mm-hmm.
who have supernatural power.
Mm-hmm.
They're tröllkonur, for example, troll women,
Mm-hmm.
who are, for example, cursing people or causing a battle to end badly.
Mm-hmm.
And here I can give you just examples of Barða saga, a very interesting saga, which has out of 6 verses, there are actually 4 by women there. But the women in that saga who present poetry, they're using it for magical, in a magical way in particular.
Mm-hmm.
Elsewhere we have, for example, in Bosa saga, one of the Fornaldarsögur, one of the legendary sagas, we have this very famous magical poem, Buslabein, which is a curse. And the people writing the saga don't dare print all of it because it's so powerful. Elsewhere in Örvar Odd saga, again, we have a priestess who is uttering a curse, talking about the burning of some form of temples and things of this kind. But again, it's a curse of some kind that's going on. So that leads us to sort of interesting connection between women and magic. And perhaps the best example of this, if you want to go to the sagas, is in, I think it's Krishna saga, when the missionary Þangbrandr is coming to Iceland to try and win over the people in Iceland to get them to turn to Christianity. On one side, we have people calling on Thor to defend Iceland, but one of the main people to call on Thor is again a woman who's called Steinun.
Mm-hmm.
And again, the verse that she presents is a very powerful verse with a lot of rhythm, a lot of sound, but it's a curse of Þangbrandr, saying his ship is going to be smashed and battered and will end up on the edge of the beach somewhere by Thor, will be destroying it. Mm-hmm. So here we have, again, poets at home to start off with, and women who have particular magical power, which is presented in the form of poetry. Mm-hmm. Elsewhere, I suppose we can mention, sorry, I'm just going on talking. There's another poem in Njál saga called Darla Ljóð, and again, Ljóð meaning magic, which is about a number of women who get together in a building, who are seen through the window, and they are weaving on a weaving frame, which involves the intestines of men, skulls hanging off it, blood running down it, and they are singing a song which is meant to have effect on a battle taking place a long way away in Ireland. So again, magical power connected with women and their power to curse people when it comes down to it.
Yeah,
so that's another aspect of poetry. Sorry, long answer.
No, it's it's okay. It was very interesting. How we were talking about women, historical women, that we have very few names preserved that composed poetry, and as you were saying, it was very difficult to understand. We have also women as an audience trying to decode that poetry that. For the people that don't know at home, it is a very complicated poetry. There are a lot of types of metrical compositions in Iceland, but we have this skaldic poetry that has a lot of kenningar, and it's very difficult to understand. And we have women composing that and also listening to that, and we also have women represented in the sagas in relation with poetry. fictional female, like wise queens, and as you said, these female trolls, giantess. And also we have this figure that maybe people will know about it, who's the vulva, no? Who tells the god Odin in poetical form about the creation of the world and about the Ragnarok. And we have, as you were saying, the representations of such powerful women in the prose of the Icelandic sagas also related with poetry. I don't know if there are more examples about all these powerful women. I was thinking maybe the Norns, which...
Absolutely, yeah.
And
in a sense, the Norns who prophesy, they prophesy in words.
Mm-hmm.
So words, and if we think in English of words, we have words like spell, for example. We have the English word is very close to the other Old English word weird, mm-hmm. which is connected to the name Urdur, mm-hmm. Which is all to do with, in a sense, magic and prophecy, mm-hmm. and the future. Mm-hmm. So within language has this power. When something is said, mm-hmm. it will change things in the future. Mm-hmm. And certainly, as you say, we have this element of prophecy, which is regularly associated with women, and associated especially with the female goddesses. We have figures like Frigg, for example. Gebrion, I think, has the same sort of power. Freya has the power of Seidr, for mm-hmm. seeing into the future. Men don't have this, and there's a question of exactly what's going on there, and whether it's to do with women, in a sense, being associated with nature, and children coming out of women, mm-hmm. in a sense, a bit like Russian dolls. All the way through, there's a strong line, mm-hmm. Which men aren't really part of in the same mm-hmm. way. So yes, we have something like Völuspá, which is the most famous mm-hmm. poem, the prophecy of the seeress. It's particularly interesting that whoever composed the original version, and this is a poem that's under construction, it's not meant to be read, it's meant to be heard initially. It's composed mm-hmm. before writing. So it's like all Old Norse poetry, it's something that was meant to be heard, which means it was also meant to be seen, which means that it was understood in context, mm-hmm. visual context mm-hmm. of a hall or somewhere else. Now, Völuspá, for example, is clearly a poem about male gods. They're the center, and the threats to them all the way through come in from the outside, from nature, and from in the female form. And it's particularly interesting that the poem itself is spoken by a female figure. Mm-hmm. So are we dealing with a man who's taking a female role? But whatever, she is in the center of a very male surrounding, mm-hmm. Which means that she's threatening, a little bit like the other female figures, but also she can see in the future. In a sense, I could argue she's almost making the future as it goes along. The same connections come up also in Eric's saga, when we have this very powerful lady, Thorbjörg Lítilvölva, the little Völva. And the Völva were very similar to the Norns, of course. Maybe they were taking on the role of Norns of some kind. And she prophesies up on a platform, and platforms are regularly mentioned as a form of stage. It can't have been inside a house, because if it was in the house, her head would have been up in the roof somewhere, mm-hmm. surrounded by meat and other things that was being smoked up there. Probably outside somewhere, but she can't do her prophecy without women singing around her. Mm-hmm. And again, it's women that she underlines. And then they find somebody who can sing the song or the chant that's needed, which is called the Varlokur. Mm-hmm. And the women don't just stand there either. They slow bring, which means that they in a sense stamped a circle, and so they're going to be dancing mm-hmm. around the platform. And again, so there's poetry associated with her prophecy, and either this poetry is meant to protect her, or it's meant to call nature spirits in from around the platform to tell her about the future. Mm-hmm. So again, we have some very powerful women, and women with the power of the word.
Yeah. Exactly.
So yes, We have male poets who are poets, but women have poetry with a little bit more when it comes down to it.
And it's this thing, I've got another example now when you were talking, Ragnar saga. Ausloik, for example, tells Ragnar, don't go to the battle, because she knows what is going to happen. So they really have a wisdom of the future. And Ausloik was also, there are some of her poems in the saga. So he spoke in verse, which is something that happens in the sagas, that they spoke in verse and she answered in verse. So, of course, she understood, and she also, there was like dialogue in verse, no? Which points out what you were saying about how did they, we are very sticked as philologists to the written tradition and to see the poems in paper. But as you were pointing out, we should think about how did they listen to the poetry, what was the context, and what was the dramatical dimension of it. So when I imagine, I don't know, that audience in the Middle Ages listened to someone representing the vulva talking about Ragnarok, and that should have been amazing for them.
Absolutely, and his respect and his fear of her at the same time. He has to give her something, some form of payment, a little bit like the skulls were given a payment for a poem, to prophesy for him. Yes, and he has to go to a woman to do this.
Exactly.
Exactly. Very powerful.
Yes. Okay, I don't know. Maybe you want to say something else, or I think.
Yeah. What is interesting? If we move into a slightly different area in terms of female power, it's noteworthy that when these women, the Volud, travel around, and when they make their prophecies, it's almost always, it's said in Erik Saga and in Örva Odd Saga that it's at the beginning of winter. And in Scandinavia, there were two seasons. There was winter and summer. There weren't four like now. And the beginning of winter was a period called the Veturnætur, the winter nights. It was a very liminal period, and it was actually roughly the same period as Halloween nowadays. And what we also need to remember is that was when the year started, according to the Norse way of looking at things, and the same with the Celtic way of looking at things. So winter comes first, night comes first. This is why we place so much emphasis on Christmas Eve, New Year's Eve. The evening comes first, and then the day later on. Because in a sense you have to get through the winter to survive for the rest of the year. So it's interesting that the beginning of winter is associated with women prophesying. It's also a sacrifice called the Dísablót. This is when the Dísir visit. And we hear a number of cases about the Dísa sacrifice to the Dísir. The most famous account is in Þiðrandar Thorhouse. And there we have some men who are inside a house celebrating a festival, but there's no mention of any women. And somebody says, do not go outside. If you hear any knock on the door, don't go outside. And we have a figure there who has to go outside when the knock comes on the door. And when he goes outside, he sees women riding onto the farm from the outside, a little bit like in Völuspá, threats from nature. And they're both dark and light, and later on it's interpreted as one a Christian bunch of women and the others a pagan. But he's killed by them, and his body is found cut to pieces next day. So again, it's a female festival at the beginning of winter. And if we look at Ireland and Scotland, and if we look at Ireland, Scotland, and Iceland, and even Norway, winter is often associated, even today, with female figures. In Iceland, you have a figure called Grýla, who eats children's sushi.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. And then we have also in Norway similar figures. And this suggests that winter was a season of women. And of course, people moved into the house at winter time. Women were the ones who held the keys. And maybe the year was divided into male, female. And this might explain why some gods go away regularly. Odin goes away, Thor goes away, Freya's looking for her husband. So maybe the strongest period for poetry and chanting and women is the winter time.
The winter time,
because women are associated with nature, the darkness, and growth. So that's just a suggestion to widen out their power in the short time you've got there.
Yeah, okay. Oh, that is very interesting. Unfortunately, we ran out of time, but thank you so much. I hope that the people who are listening to us have a little bit of interest now in women and the poetry in the Nordic Middle Ages in general. We will maybe point out some references of all the sagas. As you would have heard, there are a lot of sagas written in Iceland and a lot of references, so we hope that you would like to read them. And thank you, Terry, thank you so much for the conversation and for talking about these interesting cases and showing us your wisdom about poetry and also the representations. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you very much. Tota la gent que està seguint el nostre podcast, moltes gràcies i esperem que totes aquelles que encara no heu començat a llegir o que encara heu de llegir la poesia nòrdica medieval escrita per dones, que aquest podcast us hagi agradat i que us hagi engrescat a fer-ho. Gràcies.
Nos doigts dans l'océan.